This is a news flash from the History Channel. On May 4, 1886, 8 men were hanged by the state of Illinois. Their crime, protesting for an 8-hour workday. In the span of 7 days, they went from revered heroes to vilified anarchists. This channel is my passion project, and sharing these untold stories of the past is my dream job. So to all of you, thank you for allowing me to do this. But now let's get to the video. This included the Central Labor Union, which was made up of 14 different unions representing about 25,000 workers, mainly from skilled trades like machinists, carpenters, and cigar makers. The Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions, which had 33,000 members, also advocated for an 8-hour workday. However, an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 workers did walk off the job, shutting down the entire meatpacking industry UC. When the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions set a deadline of May 1st for employers to agree to an 8-hour day, they expected to only strike for 1 day. This way, if the bosses didn't comply, then they would strike for Solidarity Day. All 8 were charged with murder, even though none of them had actually thrown the bomb. 5 of the men were German immigrants. 2 others were Irish. 1 was an African American. The defense argued that the men had been arrested simply because they were leaders in the labor movement. Thousands marched on the streets of Chicago demanding the men's release, but the governor refused to intervene. On the morning of May, 5 of the condemned men were led to the gallows. 2 of them, Lewis Link and Albert Parsons, chose to hang themselves. 3 others, Samuel Fields, Adolph Fisher, and George Engel, went to their deaths singing revolutionary songs. Later that day, the remaining 3 men were executed in the same manner. A reporter named John Swinton uncovered new evidence that cast doubt on the men's guilt. The business leaders did, too. They knew that if they didn't agree to an 8-hour day, they would lose valuable leverage over their workers. So instead of playing fair, they hatched a plan to discredit the labor movement once and for all. They hired a team of undercover agents to infiltrate the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor. Their goal was simple: provoke a riot. And when the riot came, they would blame it on the labor leaders and use it to crack down on the labor movement. And don't forget to subscribe for more content. Thank you. As he dug deeper, he uncovered a conspiracy so vast and so corrupt that it shocked the nation. He learned that the 8 men had been framed, that their trial had been a sham. When the story broke, the public was outraged. The 8 men had been martyrs all along, and their sacrifice had not been in vain, and that the bombing itself had been orchestrated by none other than the Chicago Industrial Association. They were Oscar Neebe, August Spies, and John H.B. Sodaro. It only took the jury 3 hours to reach a verdict, but as John Swinton discovered, it wasn't long before the business leaders realized the error of their ways. The 8 men were innocent. The crackdown on the labor movement had gone too far, and the economy was suffering. To this day, May 1st is celebrated as International Workers' Day, or May Day, a time to honor the hard-won achievements of the labor movement. And every year on this day, we remember the 8 men who were hanged at Haymarket. They were not anarchists, nor were they terrorists. They were working men who were fighting for a better life for themselves and their families. So they began to plot a way to make things right. 7 of the men were found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. In fact, the papers published a completely different account. To restore order and crush the labor movement, authorities wasted no time pointing the finger at the very organizations meant to protect workers' rights. Rather than investigate who threw the bomb, they focused on discrediting the very people who had been advocating for safer working conditions and an 8-hour workday. The details were fabricated, evidence was planted, witnesses were silenced, and the truth of what happened at Haymarket was buried. The 8th man, a young unemployed printer named Rudolph Fisher, received a lighter sentence of 15 years. Together, they represented the diversity of the working class, and as such, their trial became a cause célèbre. But if they did comply, then they would go back to work as usual. After all, the men had done nothing wrong, had committed no crimes other than advocating for an 8-hour workday. But in the aftermath, public support for the labor movement waned. Many Americans came to associate unions with violence and lawlessness. Witnesses came forward claiming to have seen the men at the scene of the crime, even though they hadn't. Others said they'd heard the men discussing the bombing beforehand, even though they hadn't. In fact, much of the evidence against the 8 men was based on nothing more than their political views and their association with the labor movement. Public opinion was divided. Some believed the men were guilty and deserved punishment. Others thought they were innocent victims of circumstance. Since the bosses agreed to an 8-hour workday, The unions expected everyone to go back to work as usual. So when some workers stayed out longer than expected, it created a lot of confusion and crippled factories, mills, machine shops, and construction sites across the city. Businesses complied almost immediately, agreeing to an 8-hour day. But after only 2 days, the strike was over. By Wednesday, May, most factories were back up and running. They set a deadline of May 1st, 1886 for employers to agree to an 8-hour day or else risk a massive citywide strike. And as we will see, there was no trial. The police force was put on alert. When a crowd began gathering, they were told to make no rests unless absolutely necessary. Then as night fell, so did tensions. A bomb was thrown, killing 8 policemen and 4 civilians. Before we jump in, I just want to thank all of our viewers for 300,000 subscribers. The end of the 19th century saw unprecedented industrial growth across America. Cities were booming, factories were hiring, and immigrants were pouring in from Europe looking for a better life. But inside those factories, the reality was far from ideal. The pressure was mounting and tensions were high when the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions called a strike on May 1st, 1886. At a mass rally at Haymarket Square, they demanded an 8-hour workday and the right to join a union without fear of being fired. Machines were dangerous, workplaces were filthy, and hours were long. The average factory worker pulled 12-hour days, 6 days a week with little pay and no benefits. There were no real safety regulations, and workers were predominantly women and children. It wasn't until the 1880s that the labor movement really started taking off. Slowly but surely, workers began to unite and fight for their rights. By 1884, several unions were organized and making progress in securing collective bargaining and an 8-hour workday. In response, Chicago business leaders formed the Chicago Industrial Association and hired Pinkerton detectives to spy on union meetings and break up strikes. Not everyone participated in the strike. Not all businesses were able to comply. Not all workers could afford to strike. And not all workers were even part of a union. There was only one problem. The strike was supposed to be over after 1 day. On the evening of May 3rd, 1886, thousands of workers gathered at the Haymarket to protest the unfair dismissal of striking workers and to plan further action. When the smoke cleared, the authorities began rounding up suspects. 8 men were identified by witnesses and arrested. Their lawyers argued that the charges were politically motivated and that the men had been set up by the authorities. On May, the 8 men went on trial. The prosecution portrayed them as anarchists who had planned the bombing in advance. Almost immediately, protests erupted across the country. As you can imagine, this wasn't exactly a popular verdict. But here's where things get weird. For over a decade, the full story of what happened at Haymarket wasn't known. The trouble started right away after the bombings. To make matters worse, much of the evidence used to convict the 8 men was either false or coerced. It wasn't until 1899 that the truth of what happened at Haymarket was finally revealed. You see, the 8 men weren't the only ones who wanted an 8-hour workday, and that's exactly what happened. The bomb was thrown, the 8 men were arrested, and the labor movement was crushed. They bribed officials, intimidated witnesses, and even killed several people to cover up the truth. It wasn't until 1899 that the whole truth came out. In the aftermath of the bombing, calls for an 8-hour workday grew louder than ever. And in 1904, an 8-hour workday became law in many states. Hey, everyone, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave me a like.